Hey guys, I hope that things are going well for you at home right now. We are on our second day of online learning, and if you have any questions, make sure that you let me know. The earlier the better. This, is just a little bit of a side note, but I have to enact some limits on how much I am on my email checking for your questions. So I just want to from here on forward, here on out, I will be stopping checking emails at 3 p.m. because I need to keep a work day. And so far I've been online for hours and hours, and we don't want to do that to each other, right? So double check it. Even if you don't do it by 3 p.m., that's fine. You do you, but double check that everything's working for you on Canvas, because last minute panicked emails won't get answered. So all right, let's get into talking about our subject for today. So this is our short discussion from last time, 1984, short discussion to get us started. And the question was, to what extent do you agree or disagree with the following statement? It is impossible to change history. You cannot change the past. And I went through and read your discussions, and it seems like most people were sort of in agreement about this, that you can't actually change the things that happened, the reality of the things that happened. However, you can change the way that we perceive them, and whether or not you were thinking about that on a personal level, like through your own personal biases, or an educational level, like I think it was Jacob Strong talked about how you can't really or he talks about how moving forward, teachers will teach history in a different way, right? So our education system has a lot to do with how we perceive history. Or if we were thinking about who actually writes history, and that old sort of common saying that the history is written by the victors came up quite a lot in your responses here. Like just right here at the beginning, Sydney said history is written by the victors, and the victors will always seem like the righteous one, even if it was not good. But what's interesting about that is that we can still make those statements, right? So we can look back on history we can look back on historical accounts of things at people who have written history, and we can decide from our day and age how we interpret that interpretation of history, right? So if at one point Napoleon wrote history and the victors decided that this is how we want to see history, now we're looking back on those victors, and as victors ourselves, just by being survivors alive in 2020, we go back and interpret that. So it's like this never-ending cycle of interpretation, right? I want to look down here at Savannah's response here. She says, I agree. I think our view of history is very biased on what we actually see. Oh, this is the wrong one. Sorry. I want to go to her original post, which is, she's kind of staying pretty consistent. But here we go. No matter how you tried, what happened happened. There's no way to go back to the exact moment in time where something occurred. However, history is seen differently by every person who saw it. No one has the same details or experiences something the same way. And then we decide which historical accounts we will take as accurate and trustworthy based on which historical accounts are sort of legitimized. And then we want to think about who legitimizes the historical accounts. Is it the government? Is it academia? Can it be done individually? Thinking about the internet, this becomes extremely interesting to me, because historical accounts are almost becoming the purview of popular culture, right? So like people get together in consensus and democratically, basically, majority rules decide on which account of history to believe and not believe. That can be exciting in some ways, because we don't have this top-down authority telling us what to think. In another way, mob rule is a very terrifying idea, and mob rule on the internet to me is even more terrifying because of the miscreants who live there, you know? So yeah, it's about individual perception, but then it is also about which individual perception is prized above others. I also want to look at Grace Roach's comment. when she talks about the reality. Okay, I think that taking this statement literally, that you cannot change the past, it is impossible because it just physically is, no matter how it is contextualized or retold, it doesn't change the actual facts of the situation. But my question here, and it's also her question, she says talking about history is slightly different. What is the difference? No. How do we access history if not through talking about it? So it's that old, like, does a tree make a sound if you chop it down on the forest? Wait, what's the saying? Well, who cares? You get the idea. Can we hear the tree falling down in the forest if no one is there to hear it? Why can't I think of that? Anyway, does history actually exist if no one has an accurate portrayal of history without the biases? Okay, so one person who is thinking about this question is named Hayden White. Here's the Wikipedia article on him if you would like to get more information. This is a historian, not the footballer. And he wrote this book in the late 70s, but it was becoming most famous in the early 80s. It's called Meta-History, the Historical Imagination in 19th Century Europe. And basically what he is interested in is how history is told as a story, what he calls meta-history, because you can't, like we have been saying, it is very hard or impossible to access history without the framework around it. He has some ideas about charts and statistics and so on that let you access facts, but I think as we have gone on from the 80s, we've kind of seen how statistics can also be manipulated in certain ways, and not necessarily like with nefarious purposes, not necessarily because a politician is trying to get us to think a certain way, but just because of the way that the context frames certain statistics, you know, how we're asking questions or who we are gathering data from, etc. Anyway, so he is thinking about the way then that most historians then philosophize history, or they pair it up with an ideology. He's very interested in Marx because Marx shows the way that the bourgeois kind of shape how we see history, and then Marx is using patterns from history to create a new kind of ideological narrative. Hayden White is not anti this form of history. In fact, it's a necessary form of history, but he wants us to be aware of the way that we use narrative to shape history. Now, when he says narrative, he's talking about a few things. He's talking about creating characters and plot out of historical events, seeing things as cause and effect, and seeing the way that individual humans have produced causes and effect in history. It does not have to be that way. It's very hard to imagine historical accounts that aren't written that way because we are so used to them. But we don't have to think of history in terms of one thing caused another. There are all sorts of also causes that a historian picks and chooses from, right? So any historian is making countless choices in the way that he portrays facts, or she, let's not be sexist here, the way that she portrays the events, right? And so we are very aware of this with like documentary filmmaking, how a documentary is shaping a certain narrative through cuts and through sequences of images and so on, and through, a narrative voice that comes through in the documentary, like the sort of voice of God that tells us what to think, or which talking heads we get and how talking heads are pieced together, etc., etc. Hayden White, all the way back in the early 80s, was saying this is true of any history that we read. Okay, let me now pause this video. What I'm going to have you do is read Hayden Smith's article on this from 1984. Don't worry, you're only reading a couple pages of this. The PDF is very long, and if you want to keep reading it, like, it's fascinating stuff, but I'm just going to have you read page 1 of his actual writing, not page 1 of the PDF, but page 1 of his essay through to page 4.